For a whopping 300 years, a series of sultans ruled from Delhi, building an empire that would literally change the course of Indian history. But how did they do it? How do you control a place that big with that many people? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break down the entire machinery of the Delhi Sultanate, from their seriously clever administrative hacks to the incredible legacy they left behind.
So, here's our game plan. First up, we'll look at how Delhi even became the center of the universe for them. Then, we're diving deep into their playbook for control, the smart and sometimes pretty brutal ways they ran the show. After that, we'll get into the complicated society they built, the constant threats they had to fend off, and finally, we'll see how their big ideas ended up as the blueprint for the next massive empire.
You know, it's hard to picture India without Delhi right at its heart, but for a long time, it really wasn't a major player. It was only in the 12th century that it started to transform from just another busy trading town into the capital of a seriously powerful empire. And that's exactly where our story kicks off.
Okay, so to get our bearings, let's just quickly run through the timeline. The story really gets going with the Tomara and Chauhan Rajputs, but the Sultanate itself, that officially starts in 1206 with the early Turkish rulers. From there, you get this succession of powerful dynasties, the Khaljis, the Tughlaqs, and then the Sayyids and Lodi dynasties, which take us right into the 16th century. That's the whole 300-year saga we're covering.
So, the big question is, how did they actually build and hold on to this massive empire? Let's pop the hood and look at the machinery they created, because, trust me, pulling together a kingdom this huge required some really creative thinking. So, what was their secret sauce?
Right at the core of their political philosophy was this really elegant idea called the circle of justice. Think of it like a perfect feedback loop. A king needs soldiers to be strong. Soldiers need salaries. Salaries come from taxes paid by peasants. But peasants can only pay taxes if they're doing well, and they only do well if the king is fair and just. See how that works? It's a brilliant system where everyone's success is tied together.
Now, most of what we know about this period comes from these official histories called Tawarikh. They were all written in Persian, but here's the thing, and this is a big catch. We have to read them with a critical eye. The guys writing them were courtiers. They lived in the big cities, and they were often just writing what they thought the Sultan wanted to hear. You know, hoping for a nice reward. They were definitely pushing an agenda.
And this brings us to one of the most wild and honestly fascinating strategies the sultans used. The advice they were getting was basically, forget the nobles, forget even your own family. If you want someone you can truly count on, trust your slaves. It sounds totally backwards, right? But it was a cornerstone of their power.
These weren't just any slaves, they were a special class called bandagan. They were handpicked and bought specifically for military service, and then meticulously trained to hold the highest positions in government. And why? It's simple, really. Their entire life, their status, their power, their wealth, depended completely on one person, their master, the Sultan. They had no other loyalties.
So let's really think about this for a second. Why on earth would a slave be a better bet than your own son? Well, it all comes down to loyalty and ambition. A son might think he has a claim to the throne. He has his own friends, his own power base. He could become a rival. But a bandagan, his loyalty was absolute. It was to his master and only his master, not the master's kids. It was a pretty ruthless but brilliant way to keep things stable.
Okay, so to manage all this land, the sultans used something called the Iqta system. You can basically think of it like a franchise model for running an empire. They carved up the kingdom into territories called Iqtas and put powerful military commanders, or muktis, in charge of them.
But, and this is a huge but, these weren't independent warlords running their own little kingdoms. Oh no. The sultans kept their muktis on a very, very tight leash. A mukti had to lead armies and keep the peace, sure, but his books were audited by accountants sent from the capital. And here's the really clever part. The job wasn't for life and it wasn't hereditary. They were constantly getting moved around. This made it impossible for them to build a local power base and challenge the sultan.
Now, under super powerful rulers like Alauddin Khalji, this control went into overdrive. The state didn't just watch the tax collection. It took direct control of the whole operation. They stripped the local chieftains of their tax-collecting powers and, in a really bold move, forced those same chieftains to pay taxes themselves. This was a radical centralization of power right into the hands of the sultan.
And the taxes, they were heavy. There were three main ones. The first, called Taraj, was a tax on whatever you grew, and it was a staggering 50% of the produce. Just let that sink in for a moment. Half of everything a peasant grew went straight to the state. And on top of that, there were taxes on cattle and even on houses. This was the cost of running a massive army and a huge empire.
Okay, so the state had a tight grip on the economy, but what about the social order? Well, the official story, the one the court historians were pushing, was all about a rigid system based on who your parents were and, importantly, whether you were a man or a woman. But what was actually happening on the ground was a lot messier.
This quote here about Razia Sultan is just wow. It's so revealing. The writer, Minhaj Siraj, straight up admits she was more qualified and more capable than all of her brothers put together. But he still couldn't get his head around her being in charge. Why? Simply because she was a woman. Her skills, her excellent qualities, didn't matter in a system that was convinced only men could rule.
And check this out. It shows how different women rulers tried to deal with this impossible situation. You had Razia, who owned her identity. On her coins, she proudly announced she was the daughter of the great Sultan Iltutmish. But then you have Queen Rudramadevi down south, who took the exact opposite approach. She changed her name on inscriptions and pretended to be a man. Two powerful women, two totally different survival strategies in a world that wasn't built for them.
So, controlling society was one thing, but the Sultanate was also constantly getting squeezed by forces from both outside and inside its borders. This was, truly, an empire under siege.
From the outside, you had the terrifying Mongol invasions, which started all the way back in 1219. And on the inside, huge chunks of the country, especially dense forests, were almost impossible to govern. Plus, you had these local chieftains who were basically just waiting for the Sultan to look away for a second so they could rebel and set up their own little kingdoms.
The only possible answer to all these threats was a massive, permanent army. But of course, a huge army brings its own huge problems. It created this vicious cycle. The sultans had to keep conquering more land and squeezing more taxes out of people just to pay the soldiers they needed to hold everything together. So, with all this constant pressure, how did it all shake out in the end? Well, the Sultanate itself eventually broke apart. But its ideas, its systems of control, they didn't just vanish. They left behind a really powerful legacy that would shape India for centuries to come.
After the super-powerful Tughlaq dynasty, the Sultanate's central authority really started to crumble. Yeah, the Sayyid and Lodi dynasties still ruled from Delhi, but all over India, new independent kingdoms were popping up, and new groups like the Afghans and Rajputs were becoming major players on the scene. The old empire was falling apart.
But then, out of this chaos, this absolutely remarkable guy emerges, Sher Shah Suri, and in a totally shocking turn of events, he defeats the Mughal emperor Humayun. In just 5 years, he builds one of the most efficient governments India had ever seen. And how did he do it? What was his secret? He just borrowed and perfected the old playbook from Alauddin Khalji.
And this, right here, this is the final punchline. This is the key takeaway of the whole story. Sher Shah Suri's administration, which was built on the foundations of the Delhi Sultanate, became the exact model that the legendary Mughal Emperor Akbar would later adopt. So the Sultanate's way of governing didn't die out, it was passed on, becoming the bedrock for the next great Indian empire. The ghost of the Sultanate, in a way, lived on.
So, we've looked at the grand, brilliant machinery of an empire, but I want to leave you with one final thought, to bring it all back down to a human level. For all its clever systems, this empire was built on immense pressure. So, imagine for a second, you're a peasant. You've worked the fields all year. The tax collector shows up and demands half of everything you own. You can't pay. What do you do? What are your options? Something to think about. Thanks for watching.